Need for Speed Underground. This game is a classic in the arcade racing genre. Developed by Black Box and published by EA, back when they still put out video games instead of virtual casinos, it seems to be regarded online as one of the better entries in the Need for Speed franchise, right after Most Wanted, Hot Pursuit, and its own direct sequel. Underground was my personal introduction to the Need for Speed series, and I still enjoy playing it to this day. But I didn't grow up playing the PC version that you're seeing footage of right now. I didn't even have one of the console versions until I was a teenager. No, the version of Need for Speed Underground I had was on the Game Boy Advance. Yes, this exists. It was developed by Pocketeers, and while it is technically considered a port by EA, this game is really more like a demake that happened to launch at the same time as the game it was based on. So let's take a look at it, shall we? The first thing that I need to address here is that this is a 3D arcade racing game on the Game Boy Advance, and it doesn't use Mode 7 or any clever sprite work to fake a 3D effect like most racing games on the system. No, this game uses a proper polygonal 3D game engine for all the environments and vehicles, and this is pretty impressive considering they did it all on the Game Boy Advance. But, well, it's the Game Boy Advance. The hardware here just isn't really cut out for rendering an entire level's worth of 3D geometry like this, and the results of the choice to go with a 3D engine permeate the entire experience of this game, usually for the worse. To start with, the frame rate during gameplay constantly fluctuates between about 15 and 25 frames a second, but it does sometimes manage to pull itself up to a full 30 for a few brief seconds. This is just about the bare minimum that I'd consider playable in terms of frame rate, and it still managed to give me a headache during some of my play sessions. So we're off to a good start, clearly. There's also a fair bit of screen tearing here, and it can get pretty bad when the frame rate decides to take a dive. This happens on both a handheld GBA and the GameCube Game Boy player, but it's much more noticeable on the Game Boy player due to the game being blown up on a television screen. What might be worse than the performance, though, is the resolution. The GBA's 240 by 160 pixel display obviously isn't going to be great for 3D games to begin with, but here it's made even worse by the hardware's other limitations. The game's internal resolution appears to be cut in half for objects beyond a certain distance from the camera, and combined with the low texture resolution of foreground objects, the environments as a whole look way more blocky and pixelated than most other GBA titles. When my girlfriend first saw me playing this game, one of the very first things she said was, "That looks like pixel vomit," and I honestly can't think of a much better description for the visuals here. All the tracks in this game have a bright yellow line right down the middle of the road to indicate what direction you're supposed to go, and as silly as it might look, it is absolutely necessary at this resolution. The few corners where these lines aren't clearly visible when you go around them are the toughest in the entire game, because you can't always tell what's a wall and what's a road until it's too late. This problem usually isn't too bad when playing on either the TV or one of the later GBA models that has a proper backlight, but the color contrast is much more difficult to see on both the original GBA and the first revision of the SP that I had as a kid. I distinctly remember there were a couple of tracks in this game that I used to struggle with quite a bit, because it was difficult to tell which direction to go when coming around certain corners. Even with a decent display, I'll still occasionally hit walls when rounding a corner because the color contrast is so bad in some spots, and the low resolution can make it hard to tell exactly where the hitboxes are. In fact, the overall level of detail here is so low to begin with that I can take off my glasses while playing this game from across the room, and it doesn't significantly impact my ability to play. As horrendous as Need for Speed Underground's visuals are, the sound design on the Game Boy might be even worse. There's a reason all the footage you've seen up until now has been muted. The designers tried to replicate the realistic vehicle sounds found in the other versions of this game, but it just does not work with the Game Boy's limited sound hardware. All the sound effects are bit crushed to hell and range from droning brown noise to high-frequency shrieks that are physically painful to listen to. All the cars in this game use the exact same engine, brake, and tire sounds. They just get pitch shifted up or down depending on the vehicle and how fast it's going. Higher frequencies correlate with higher speed, so the soundscape here becomes increasingly irritating as you progress through the game and unlock better cars. The worst offender here by far is the tire screech effect. This shrill, high-frequency noise plays every time you hit the brake or take a corner at speed. It becomes grating almost immediately and only gets worse over time. I previously assumed that the original sound effect couldn't possibly be this bad, and that most of the high-pitched awfulness here must be a result of the GBA's built-in speaker being terrible. But after playing Need for Speed Underground on the Game Boy player, I can confirm that this sound effect has a complete lack of bass frequencies. If anything, it sounds worse on a decent hi-fi system because the high frequencies are so much more amplified. The other sound effects in this game don't fare a whole lot better. Not only do most of them sound like crunchy static, but everything here has been gain boosted to an absolutely insane degree. Seriously, this game is loud. I had to rush to turn down my receiver the first time I played this on my TV so I wouldn't wake up my neighbors. I can demonstrate just how loud this is with the graphic equalizer that I have hooked up in my game room. This is what the level meters on it looked like for about 90% of my playtime. They are just peaking pretty much constantly. Just as a comparison, here's what the levels of the Pokemon Ruby intro music look like on the same setup. This is the first time I've ever heard of a video game becoming a victim of the loudness war, and just like the worst of its record industry counterparts, Need for Speed Underground is loud to the point where any sort of dynamic range is almost non-existent. All the awful, bit-crushed sound effects start to blend together into a crunchy, muddy wall of noise that's occasionally punctuated by the shrill wail of the tire screech. I can only assume that the game volume was boosted to make sure it could be heard clearly on the GBA's crappy built-in speaker, but if you use anything besides that, it just makes the game sound worse than it would have otherwise. And that's just the sound effects. I still haven't talked about the music. This port features a cut-down version of the licensed soundtrack found in every other version of Need for Speed Underground. And when I say cut down, I mean that in more ways than one. There's obviously fewer tracks present here than on other platforms due to the space limitations of a cartridge versus a DVD, but the songs that are included are shortened edits of the full versions and are bit crushed to the same degree as all the other sound effects. I kept the music in this game turned off for most of the video because, like I said, it's all licensed and YouTube is not a fan of copyrighted music in videos. But I've got a really short clip here that I think I can get away with just to give you an idea of how terrible the music sounds. Now imagine listening to that at the same time as all the other sound effects you've already heard. The audio quality here is just good enough that you can make out what the music is supposed to sound like, but awful enough that you would never want to actually listen to it. The way the music is integrated into the game isn't that great either. It's fine when you're in a race and it just plays in the background like any other racing game, but the music that plays on the menus is a mess. For some reason, the current track restarts from the beginning every single time you navigate to a different menu screen, which you have to do a minimum of 2 times between every race in Underground mode. So you end up hearing a lot of this. All that being said, if you can somehow overlook the massive issues in both the visual and audio departments, Need for Speed Underground on the Game Boy Advance is actually kind of an okay game. The core gameplay loop of win races to earn money, to buy upgrades, to win more races, is a solid enough foundation that's able to remain engaging even in this cut-down form. Underground mode works more or less the same way as it does in other versions of this game, in that each night you have to either challenge or be challenged by another racer, who you then must beat in order to avoid falling lower on the overall leaderboard. The event progression has been restructured though, and it's a little bit strange in my opinion. In most racing games, Need for Speed Underground included, the career mode consists of a single, more or less predetermined series of events to compete in. The designers will typically change up the event type at least once every couple of races in order to keep the game from getting too repetitive. Need for Speed Underground on the Game Boy doesn't really do this. Instead, there are 4 separate leaderboards to climb, one for each event type in the game. There are no restrictions on how often you can compete in any given event type, and your ranking in one event type doesn't really have an impact on the others. This means you can climb all the way to the top of one leaderboard in one type of event, and literally never play any of the others, which is what I did as a kid because the interface on this menu isn't really the best designed, and I didn't realize there were event types aside from Circuit Race until I'd already topped the leaderboard in it. Coming back to this game as an adult, I had forgotten about the multiple leaderboard setup, and got about halfway through the circuit events before realizing that there wasn't really any event variety and something must be up. Even ignoring the weirdness that is the separate leaderboards, the progression in this game is a little bit wonky. There are 2 leagues for each event type, an amateur and a pro league, with the pro league having twice as many races and being more difficult. This setup usually works pretty well for racing games, but here it makes the game feel needlessly padded. There's not a gradual ramp-up in difficulty within either of these 2 leagues. There is, however, an abrupt and noticeable difficulty spike when you move from the amateur league to the pro league. But aside from that, the difficulty curve is completely flat, and if anything, it slopes down a little within each league because you're constantly upgrading your vehicle's performance. This game is very much on the easy side, presumably to help compensate for the awful visuals and performance that can make it difficult to navigate at times. The Pro League provides a little bit of a challenge, but the Amateur League is so easy it's a joke if you're playing on a decent display. I won every single event in the Amateur Circuit League on my first attempt. Most of the time I didn't even see my opponents after we left the starting line. The biggest challenge of these races is just to drive the requisite number of laps without falling asleep. The amateur leagues in this game all feel like a tutorial for the actual game that for some reason takes up a third of the runtime. As I already mentioned, you'll occasionally be challenged by racers whom you've already beaten, and when this happens, you get to set the parameters for the race. But for some reason, the minimum number of laps you can choose is 2. Meanwhile, all the other drivers who you challenge will occasionally have 1-lap races. So when you get challenged in the early sections of the game, you don't even have the option of making these dull races as short as they could be. As for the actual racing, it's generally okay, at least once you get to the Pro League and the AI actually starts trying. The driving is functional, if a bit basic. It's about as good as you could reasonably hope for given this game's technical limitations. Steering, braking, and drifting all work pretty much as you'd expect, but the game doesn't acknowledge power slides, hang time, or drafting behind vehicles the way Need for Speed Underground proper does. The nitrous boost is still here, but I'm not convinced it actually makes your car faster so much as it stretches out the environment and reduces your ability to steer. The vehicle physics exist, though I'm not sure there's much you can say for them beyond that. There is an attempt made to simulate realistic suspension, but it's not super noticeable until you hit an incline, and when you do, it feels like the whole car is suddenly balanced on top of a pivot point that it rolls around on. In a similar vein, all the cars have this little backfire animation that denotes a gear shift. It's a small detail that's only worth bringing up because it's positioned in the exact same spot on every car, regardless of where the tailpipe actually is. I already mentioned that this game has multiple event types, and specifically they are Circuit, Sprint, Drag, and Drift. All of these modes can be found in other versions of Need for Speed Underground, but the one event type that didn't make it over to this port is Knockout. Circuit and Sprint races are both pretty much the exact same thing. You know how this works, whoever crosses the finish line first wins, and in this game there's not much more to it than that. The circuit races are on, well, a circuit, and the sprint races are a dash from point A to B. Despite the fact that there's nothing really special about either of these event types, these two modes are easily the best part of the game. Drift mode works okay, but the low resolution and frame rate make it pretty much impossible to pull off risky turns that barely miss the wall, which kinda defeats the whole purpose of the mode. Not to mention that doing well in a drift event means that you get to hear that tire screech sound play effectively non-stop, and you already know how I feel about that. And finally we have drag races. I think that this mode actually could have been pretty good here, because the drag races in Need for Speed Underground are literally straightforward, and that design plays to the very few strengths that the Game Boy version has. Unfortunately, there's one thing about drag mode that renders it pretty much unplayable here, at least for me, and that's the screen shake. Screen shake can be a tricky thing to get right, even in modern games running on current-gen hardware that have access to all the resolution in the world. But with the low resolution and frame rate found here, the effect makes me nauseous. I could not physically stand to play more than 2 drag events in this game. It's that bad. Unsurprisingly, I spent the majority of my playtime in the circuit and sprint modes instead. There's one more aspect of this game I need to talk about, which is probably the defining feature of Need for Speed Underground, and that's the vehicle customization. This might just be the single strongest aspect of the GBA port. While it's nowhere near as extensive or polished as it is on other platforms, the developers seem to have brought over as many customization options as they could, and most of what was left out are little things like window decals and brake clippers that would be too small to see with this game's poor resolution. They also left out most of the upgrade components that were licensed from real-world automotive brands, either due to resource limitations or licensing issues that only pertain to this version of the game for some reason. But larger things like bumpers, side skirts, rims, window tint, vinyls, and neon are all present and accounted for, along with all the performance upgrades. The details of the upgrade system have been slightly altered, however. The order that the upgrades unlock in has been changed for seemingly no reason, and the upgrade progression feels a bit slower overall. This is a game where you can't repaint your vehicle until you've completed an entire amateur league's worth of events. The value of visual upgrades has also been made more ambiguous. In other versions of Need for Speed Underground, adding more visual flair to your car increases the number of style points your car earns for things like power slides, jumps, and shortcuts, style points being the game's main measure of progression that determines when new upgrades get unlocked. So driving a car with more visual upgrades will get you access to better performance upgrades. It all ties together. The style point system seems to be completely absent from the GBA port, though, and I'm not entirely sure what effect, if any, visual upgrades have on gameplay or progression here. I did notice that the prize pool for races would sometimes jump up after I did a round of upgrades on my car, but I'm not sure if that was correlated more with visual flair or just the total number of events I'd won, though it does affect all leaderboards. You may have also noticed that in all my footage of the upgrade screen, the camera is continuously rotated around the vehicle. That's a bit of a problem, because the game moves the camera like this non-stop, which can make it quite tedious to get a good look at some of the visual upgrades, especially front and rear bumpers. Now, I know that this game has some pretty severe technical limitations and was presumably developed under tight time constraints, but based on the small amount of game development experience I have, I can say that it probably wouldn't have been too hard to add a condition to some of these options to lock the camera at a fixed point in its rotation, in order to get a better look at what you're customizing. Despite all the technical limitations and game design quirks, I still do have a bit of a soft spot for this game. I had several racing games for the GBA as a kid, but Need for Speed Underground was always my favorite. I think that's because it is an actual full 3D racing game. The other racing games I had used the aforementioned sprite tricks and rotation effects to fake a 3D effect, and that just doesn't do it for me when it comes to racing games. Like first-person shooters, this is a genre that needs polygonal 3D environments in order to work well, and Need for Speed Underground is one of the few games that actually manages to deliver that on the Game Boy Advance. I actually played this game so much as a kid that I unlocked every car and nearly every upgrade, and then I promptly stopped playing it as soon as I got a Pokemon game for my birthday. Before I wrap up, I also want to take a quick look at the changes made from this game to the GBA port of Need for Speed Underground 2. This game is built on the same engine as its prequel, and it fixes just about everything I had a problem with in the first game. There have been a number of technical improvements. The resolution of distant objects has been increased, so it's easier to see where you're going. The frame rate is still low, but is generally more consistent, and screen tearing is much less of an issue. The color palette in the environments is also more varied, so it's easier to see where you're going. The vehicle handling has been tweaked, so the game feels more responsive, and they even address smaller issues like the rotating customization camera and lack of paint options at the start of the game. And that's not to mention the god-awful tire screech sound, which has been made much better here. This actually feels like a proper 3D console racing game on the Game Boy Advance, and I'm genuinely impressed. The only thing that feels like this port is missing is the open world that was a key selling point of Need for Speed Underground 2 on other platforms. I think I would have much rather had this game as a kid than the first one, and I would personally recommend that this is the one you play if you for some reason want to play Need for Speed Underground on Game Boy. It's pretty much the exact same game as the first, just better in almost every way. I think that just about wraps it up for this video. If you watched this far, thanks for sticking around. You can leave a like or comment or subscribe to this channel if you want to see similar videos. Anyway, I'm out of here. Bye.
Do a barrel roll!